The modern financial system operates on a principle that is rarely stated openly but consistently practiced. Profits belong to the few, while losses are absorbed by the many. This is not an accidental outcome of crises or mismanagement. It is a structural feature embedded deeply within the architecture of global finance. To understand it, one must look beyond surface-level events and examine incentives, power dynamics, and the invisible rules that govern decision-making at the highest levels. When financial institutions generate profits, those gains are retained privately. Executives receive bonuses, shareholders see rising returns, and stock valuations increase. Success is celebrated as a result of intelligence, innovation, and strategic risk-taking. The rewards are immediate, concentrated, and protected. There is no mechanism that distributes these gains broadly across society, even though the system itself relies on public infrastructure, legal protections, and central bank backstops. However, when those same risks lead to failure, the outcome follows a completely different logic. Losses do not remain confined to the institutions that created them. Instead, they are transferred outward. Governments intervene, central banks inject liquidity, and public funds are mobilized to stabilize the system. The burden shifts from private balance sheets to national economies, and ultimately to ordinary citizens who had no role in the decisions that caused the collapse. This asymmetry creates a powerful incentive structure. If an institution knows that it can retain profits during periods of growth while externalizing losses during downturns, its natural behavior will be to take on greater risk. The downside is limited, but the upside remains fully accessible. Over time, this encourages increasingly aggressive strategies, complex financial engineering, and the accumulation of hidden vulnerabilities within the system. The concept can be understood through a simple analogy. Imagine a game where a player keeps all winnings but shares losses with everyone else in the room. In such a game, caution becomes irrational. The optimal strategy is to take the largest possible risks because the consequences of failure are diluted across a wider group. What appears reckless from the outside becomes perfectly logical within the framework of incentives. This dynamic is reinforced by the scale and interconnectedness of modern financial institutions. Large banks are not isolated entities. They are deeply integrated into payment systems, credit markets, and global trade. Their failure would trigger cascading effects that extend far beyond their own operations. As a result, governments face immense pressure to intervene during crises, not necessarily to save the institutions themselves, but to prevent systemic collapse. Yet this necessity creates a paradox. The more essential these institutions become, the more likely they are to be rescued, and the more certain that rescue becomes, the less incentive they have to limit risk. The system, in effect, rewards size, complexity, and interconnectedness, even though these very qualities increase systemic vulnerability. Public perception often frames bailouts as emergency measures taken under extraordinary circumstances. But from a structural perspective, they are predictable outcomes of a system designed with implicit guarantees. Market participants understand, even if it is not formally acknowledged, that certain institutions will not be allowed to fail. This expectation is priced into behavior long before any crisis occurs. The consequences of this arrangement extend beyond financial markets. When losses are socialized, they manifest in various forms that affect everyday life. Governments may increase debt to fund bailouts, leading to future taxation. Central banks may expand the money supply, contributing to inflation that erodes purchasing power. Public spending priorities may shift, reducing investment in social services to accommodate financial stabilization efforts. In this way, the cost of financial risk-taking is distributed across society in subtle but significant ways. It is not presented as a direct bill to citizens, but it is paid nonetheless through diminished economic stability and long-term fiscal constraints. The connection between a bank's failed investment and an individual's rising cost of living may not be immediately visible, but it is part of the same chain of cause and effect. At the same time, the concentration of profits reinforces inequality. Those who are positioned within the financial system benefit disproportionately during periods of growth. Asset prices rise, capital gains accumulate, and wealth becomes increasingly concentrated. Meanwhile, those outside the system experience fewer benefits but remain exposed to the consequences of downturns. This dual effect, privatized gains and socialized losses, creates a feedback loop. Wealth concentration increases influence, and influence shapes policy. Regulatory frameworks, monetary interventions, and crisis responses are all influenced by the need to maintain stability within the financial system. Over time, this alignment of interests further entrenches the existing structure, making meaningful change difficult. The issue is not simply one of fairness, but of systemic stability. A system that encourages risk without corresponding accountability will inevitably produce cycles of boom and bust. Each cycle may differ in its specific triggers, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. Risk accumulates during periods of optimism. Vulnerabilities are ignored or underestimated, and when the system reaches a breaking point, losses are transferred outward to preserve core institutions. Understanding this principle requires moving beyond individual events and recognizing the continuity between them. Financial crises are often treated as isolated incidents caused by unique circumstances. In reality, they are manifestations of the same underlying logic repeated over time. The details change, but the structure remains. The phrase, "profits are privatized, losses are socialized," captures this dynamic in its simplest form, but its implications are far-reaching. It challenges the notion of a free market operating on equal terms and reveals a system where risk and reward are distributed unevenly by design. It forces a reconsideration of how financial moral hazard is not a visible force. It does not appear in balance sheets, it is not announced in policy statements, and it is rarely acknowledged in public discourse. Yet it quietly shapes behavior at the highest levels of finance. It emerges when the consequences of risk are separated from those who take it, creating an environment where caution becomes optional and recklessness becomes rational. At its core, moral hazard is about incentives. When individuals or institutions are protected from the full impact of their decisions, their behavior changes. They begin to take risks they would otherwise avoid, not because they are irrational, but because the structure around them has altered the cost-benefit calculation. The downside is limited or shared, while the upside remains personal and immediate. In the financial system, this dynamic is amplified by scale. Large institutions operate with the implicit understanding that their failure would have consequences far beyond their own operations. They are deeply embedded in the functioning of the economy, connected to credit markets, payment systems, and global trade flows. Because of this interconnectedness, their collapse is not just a private event, but a systemic threat. This creates a powerful expectation. When risk turns into failure, intervention is likely. Governments and central banks step in to stabilize markets, provide liquidity, and prevent cascading collapse. These actions are often justified as necessary to protect the broader economy, and in many cases they are. But the anticipation of such interventions begins to influence behavior long before any crisis occurs. Financial actors do not need explicit guarantees. The pattern itself becomes the guarantee. Over time, repeated interventions establish a precedent that shapes expectations. Institutions begin to operate under the assumption that extreme outcomes will be managed externally. This assumption is rarely stated openly, but it is embedded in decision-making processes, risk models, and strategic planning. As a result, risk-taking evolves. It becomes more aggressive, more complex, and more opaque. Financial instruments are designed to maximize returns under favorable conditions, often without fully accounting for tail risks. Leverage increases, balance sheets expand, and vulnerabilities accumulate in ways that are difficult to detect until they become critical. From the outside, this behavior may appear irresponsible, but within the system, it is consistent with the incentives in place. If the potential rewards are high and the potential losses are partially insulated, then pursuing higher risk strategies becomes a logical choice. The system does not discourage such behavior, it quietly encourages it. This is where moral hazard becomes dangerous. It does not create immediate instability. In fact, during periods of growth, it can contribute to rapid expansion and rising asset prices. Markets appear strong, institutions report profits, and confidence increases. The underlying risks remain hidden, dispersed across complex networks and layered financial products. The problem emerges when these risks begin to materialize. Because they have been underestimated or ignored, the system is often unprepared for their full impact. What seemed manageable under normal conditions becomes destabilizing under stress. Liquidity dries up, asset values fall, and interconnected exposures amplify the shock. At this point, the same dynamic that encouraged risk-taking now compels intervention. Authorities step in to contain the damage, not necessarily to reward the institutions involved, but to prevent broader collapse. The actions taken may include bailouts, emergency lending, or large-scale monetary expansion. These measures stabilize the system in the short term, but they also reinforce the expectations that contributed to the crisis in the first place. This creates a cycle. Risk-taking leads to instability. Instability leads to intervention, and intervention reinforces the conditions for future risk-taking. Each iteration of the cycle may differ in its details, but the underlying mechanism remains consistent. Moral hazard does not disappear. It adapts and persists. One of the most subtle aspects of this process is its invisibility to the general public. The language used to describe financial interventions often emphasizes necessity and urgency, framing them as responses to extraordinary circumstances. While this is accurate in the immediate context, it obscures the longer-term pattern. The focus remains on the crisis itself rather than the incentives that made it more likely. For individuals outside the financial system, the effects are indirect but significant. They may experience economic downturns, job losses, or rising costs of living without a clear understanding of how these outcomes are connected to decisions made within large institutions. The link between moral hazard and everyday economic conditions is not always visible, but it is deeply embedded in the structure of the system. Within institutions, the presence of moral hazard can also influence internal culture. Risk management may be treated as a formality rather than a constraint. Short-term performance becomes the dominant metric, while long-term stability receives less attention. Decision-makers are rewarded for success in favorable conditions, but the consequences of failure are often deferred or absorbed at a higher level. This misalignment between risk and accountability extends beyond individual firms. It becomes a systemic characteristic that shapes the behavior of the entire financial sector. Competition reinforces it, as institutions that take greater risks may achieve higher returns in the short term, pressuring others to follow similar strategies to remain competitive. Regulatory frameworks attempt to address these issues, but they operate within the same environment. Rules can be designed to limit certain types of risk, but they cannot fully eliminate the underlying incentives. As long as the expectation of intervention remains, moral hazard continues to influence behavior in subtle ways. The challenge lies in the balance between stability and discipline. Allowing large institutions to fail without support could lead to severe economic consequences. Providing support, on the other hand, can encourage the very behavior that increases systemic risk. This tension is not easily resolved, and it sits at the center of modern financial governance. Understanding moral hazard requires recognizing that it is not simply a problem of individual behavior, but a feature of the system itself. It arises from the interaction between institutions, policies, and expectations. It is sustained by the need to maintain stability, even when that stability depends on actions that alter incentives. In this environment, risk is not just a financial calculation. It is shaped by beliefs about how the system will respond under stress. These beliefs influence decisions in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. They create conditions where the pursuit of higher returns aligns with the assumption that extreme losses will not be borne fully by those who take the risks. And as long as that assumption remains embedded within the system, the forces that drive moral hazard will continue to operate beneath the surface, guiding behavior, shaping outcomes, and influencing the trajectory of financial cycles without ever needing to be explicitly acknowledged or formally declared. Systems are organized, and who ultimately bears responsibility for their outcomes. And within that structure, every decision, every policy, and every crisis response reinforces the same fundamental imbalance, shaping a system where success is owned privately, but failure becomes a collective burden carried by society as a whole, without ever being explicitly acknowledged or directly assigned to those who created it. Bailouts are often presented as acts of necessity, urgent interventions designed to prevent economic collapse and restore stability to a system on the brink. In moments of crisis, the narrative is clear and compelling. Without immediate action, the consequences would be catastrophic. Jobs would vanish, markets would freeze, and the ripple effects would extend far beyond the financial sector into the fabric of everyday life. Within this framing, bailouts appear not as choices but as obligations. Yet beneath this surface lies a more complex reality. Bailouts do not operate in a neutral space. They are targeted, selective, and structured in ways that prioritize the survival of institutions over the well-being of the broader public. While they may stabilize markets in the short term, their design reveals a deeper alignment with the preservation of financial systems rather than the protection of ordinary citizens. When a large financial institution faces collapse, the immediate concern is systemic risk. These institutions are interconnected through lending, derivatives, and global capital flows. Their failure is not contained, it spreads. Governments and central banks intervene to prevent this chain reaction, injecting liquidity, guaranteeing liabilities, or directly recapitalizing firms. These actions are justified on the grounds that the alternative would be far worse. But this justification raises an important distinction. Saving the system does not necessarily mean saving the people within it. The mechanisms used to stabilize financial institutions are not the same as those that support households, workers, or small businesses. Liquidity provided to banks does not automatically translate into relief for individuals struggling with unemployment or rising living costs. The benefits of intervention are unevenly distributed. In practice, bailouts tend to protect the core structures of finance, balance sheets, asset values, and institutional continuity. They ensure that markets continue to function, that credit remains available, and that confidence is restored among investors. These are important objectives, but they are not synonymous with public welfare. The assumption that stabilizing financial institutions will naturally benefit society as a whole is not always borne out in reality. One reason for this disconnect lies in the transmission mechanism. Financial support flows first to institutions, with the expectation that it will eventually reach the broader economy through lending and investment. However, this process is neither immediate nor guaranteed. Banks may choose to strengthen their own positions rather than extend credit, especially in uncertain conditions. Capital can remain concentrated within the financial sector, while the real economy experiences prolonged strain. At the same time, the costs of bailouts are distributed across society in less visible ways. Public funds used for rescues increase government debt, which may lead to future taxation or reduced public spending. Monetary interventions, such as large-scale asset purchases, can contribute to inflation or asset price inflation, affecting purchasing power and wealth distribution. These effects are gradual, often indirect, but deeply consequential. The perception of fairness becomes a critical issue. When institutions that engaged in high-risk behavior are preserved through public support, while individuals face the full consequences of economic downturns, trust in the system begins to erode. The message, whether intended or not, is that certain actors are shielded from failure, while others are expected to absorb it. This dynamic is further complicated by the way bailouts are structured. Support is often provided with conditions, but these conditions tend to focus on financial metrics rather than social outcomes. Requirements may include capital adequacy, restructuring plans, or limits on certain activities, but they rarely address the broader distributional impact of the intervention. The primary goal remains the stabilization of the institution, not the redistribution of its benefits. Moreover, the timing of bailouts plays a significant role. Interventions are typically reactive, occurring after risks have already materialized into crises. By the time support is deployed, the damage to the broader economy may already be underway. Job losses, business closures, and declines in income can occur rapidly, while the recovery facilitated by financial stabilization unfolds more slowly and unevenly. The asymmetry between speed and impact highlights a structural imbalance. Financial markets can be stabilized quickly through targeted interventions, but the real economy requires sustained support that is often more difficult to deliver. As a result, the immediate beneficiaries of bailouts are those within the financial system, while the broader population experiences a delayed and uncertain recovery. Political considerations also shape the nature of bailouts. Large financial institutions possess significant influence, both directly and indirectly. Their role in the economy grants them a level of importance that translates into policy priority. Decision-makers must weigh the consequences of allowing such institutions to fail against the public perception of using taxpayer resources to support them. This tension influences how bailouts are designed and communicated. Public narratives often emphasize the necessity of intervention while downplaying its distributional effects. The focus remains on avoiding worst-case scenarios which, while valid, can obscure the long-term implications of repeated bailouts. Over time, these interventions contribute to a perception that the system operates with different rules for different participants. For ordinary citizens, the experience of a bailout is rarely direct. It is felt through second-order effects, changes in employment conditions, shifts in public services, or fluctuations in the cost of living. These outcomes are not always immediately linked to the initial intervention, making it difficult to assess the true impact of bailouts on everyday life. The complexity of the system creates a distance between cause and effect. Meanwhile, within the financial sector, the survival of institutions reinforces expectations about future crises. The knowledge that intervention is likely in extreme situations influences behavior, even if unintentionally. It becomes part of the strategic environment, shaping decisions about risk, leverage, and exposure. This creates a subtle but powerful feedback loop. Bailouts stabilize the system, but they also validate the assumptions that made them necessary. Institutions continue to operate within a framework where survival is prioritized, and the consequences of failure are partially absorbed by external support. The system becomes more resilient in the short term, but potentially more fragile over longer cycles. Understanding bailouts requires looking beyond their immediate function as crisis management tools. They are also signals, indicators of how the system allocates protection and responsibility. They reveal which parts of the economy are considered essential and which are expected to adjust without direct support. The distinction between protecting institutions and protecting the public is not always clear, but it is crucial. A system that prioritizes stability through institutional preservation must also address the broader distribution of its costs and benefits. Without this balance, the gap between financial recovery and social recovery can widen, shaping economic outcomes in ways that extend far beyond the moment of crisis and continue to influence behavior, expectations, and trust within the system as it evolves over time without fundamentally altering the underlying priorities that define how and for whom stability is achieved.